My story doesn't begin with potatoes, but it starts in a dining hall. This dining hall is the hall of one of the colleges at Oxford University, and it's particularly spectacular, so I'm told. I'm sure they're all lovely, but this one has a magnificent roof that's supported by these ginormous oak beams. Early in the 1900s, last century, some busy entomologist was up in the rafters, and he was looking around at different insects, when he discovered that there was a beetle infestation. He scurried back down to speak to the dean of the college and said, unless something is done, this roof is going to collapse in on itself. Understandably, they were quite worried. Where on earth were they going to find such ginormous oak trees to replace the beams? And that's where the college forester stepped up and said I might be able to help. When the college was built in the 1300s, and they were building this magnificent roof, they had the foresight to think that at some point down the track, they would need to replace the roof. And so the foresters, generation after generation, had looked after a particular grove of oak trees so that when it was needed, it could be put to good use. Because, so the legend goes, oak always becomes beetly in the end. I tell that story, one, because it's a lovely story, but also because it helps to illustrate what I mean when I say intergenerational equity, or cooperation, or collaboration. And it's putting that into practice. The 1987 definition of sustainable development from the Brundtland Commission says, sustainable development is one generation meeting its needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So back in the 1300s, they were already thinking that way. And that's what I've been doing the last few years, is try and put that intergenerational equity into practice. So about 5 years ago, thanks to a couple of very inspirational young people, Emma Bierman and Casper Tikel, who set up the UK Youth Climate Coalition, we went to the UN climate talks to take the perspective of young people to the table, to the corridors, to the hallways, and say, you're deciding our future. Do you not think that maybe we should have a say in what it's going to look like? So we found ourselves in the middle of December in Poznan, in Poland. It was quite dreary. Running around, running campaigns, we met up with hundreds of other young people from all over the world who were doing the same thing, who were saying, you're writing about our future, you're writing about 2050, can we have a say in what it looks like? And some of the campaigns were animated and the actions were brilliant, but towards the end of the conference, I was kept awake one night because I felt really powerless. I felt, despite the fact that we were coming up with these great ideas and trying to put these answers on the table and say, here's a solution, why don't you think about it? That we weren't really able to influence the process. There were many competing interests in that process, and it's quite difficult to say, if you help out and safeguard our future, a wave of moral goodness will wash over you. That's all we can offer in return. And that night, as I lay awake, I was caught in what I'm going to call my fear sandwich. I had my fear dragon behind me, nipping at my heels, saying, you have to keep going, you have to run faster, you have to keep speaking up for the future, because sometimes it does look a bit bleak, a bit doom and gloom when we think about climate change and environmental degradation. And I had this fear dragon in front of me, standing there. Well, I don't really know if dragons stand like this, but sort of saying, well, I'm a dragon and you can't get past, and you don't know what the answers are, and you'll never be able to find them because you're afraid. And I came back from that conference feeling quite disempowered, dispirited, disillusioned, and I said to myself, I'm never going back to the UN ever again. So naturally, 3 months later, I found myself on a train going to the follow-up meeting of the UN climate talks, this time held in Bonn, in Germany. And instead of taking answers or solutions, the group of youth campaigners and myself, we thought, we'll take some questions. One question in particular. In fact, we had a whole box of T-shirts made up with this question written across the front. And we just so happened to get a lucky break, and the chair of the session, very grateful, gave us a slot to speak, to ask this question. So there I was, at my microphone, ready to speak, with my T-shirt on with this question above it, and I thought, oh my goodness, there is my fear dragon out to haunt me. Oh no, wait, that's my face on this massive screen in front of the UN. it was quite terrifying, but I didn't have time to go through an existential conversation in my head about overcoming my fear. Dragon was about overcoming myself. My microphone was flashing, and I had to speak. And so I did. And I asked the UN Plenary Hall, as I'm going to ask you now, how old will you be in the year 2050? Not necessarily to find the answer to that question, and I can see some of you are going to be trying to work it out in your head, but to invite the delegates in that room to step into a space, to think differently about the work that they were doing, and to live the question. Because that's the point, isn't it? The delegates in the room are writing about 2050 and making agreements about what is going to shape our future, but they're not necessarily going to be around to see that. Terry Pratchett, one of my favourite authors of all time and a bit of a hero of mine, writes in his Discworld series about the god of wine, Biblia. And Biblia drinks wine wherever he goes, and he has a party and he makes merry, knowing that he's not going to wake up with a hangover. That falls to the lot of Bilius, the god of hangovers. Poor Bilius. He's never touched a drop of wine in his entire life, and yet, without fail, every morning he wakes up with a hangover. It's a bit like climate change, environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. We've been having a bit of a party, thinking that maybe we're not going to have to deal with a hangover. I admit that we are starting to feel some of the hangover right now, and there are many of you in this room who I'm sure, and we're going to hear about, have RSVP'd no to that particular party. But still, future generations are really going to bear the brunt of that hangover. And that's why my work has been to try and bring young people into the process, to ask these different questions. Because the thing about questions is it creates a new realm of possibility within our current concept of reality. It creates a space, a liminal space, some people call it, the space between, some people call it the dark space. It creates a space to step in and say, I don't know what the answers are, but if you join me in this space and we live the question, maybe we can start to work together to think about what the answers and the solutions might be. But there's something else that I've learned with doing my work. That it's not just about creating that space and stepping up into it. It's about what you bring into that space from deep inside you. I've learned that a lot of these institutions, in my experience, are upheld by, fear. Fear of not knowing the answer, fear of not being able to reach the solution, fear that motivates, fear that holds back. And if I'm perfectly honest with you, the thing that motivated me most was my fear dragon, chasing at my heels. Run faster. You have to do this or else. And I realized that when I stepped into that space with fear, that I could only be met by fear. And so I learned that it was actually about not overcoming my fear, but having courage. What does that mean? Brené Brown of the Vulnerability TED fame. If you haven't seen her TED talk, I really, really encourage you to, because it's absolutely phenomenal. Brené Brown talks a lot about vulnerability and courage. And she goes back to the original definition and understanding of courage. And she says it's to speak your story with the whole of your heart. And she offers this story to illustrate. St. George slayed the dragon. He overcame the dragon because he was brave, and that showed bravery. St. Martha, on the other hand, befriended the dragon and tamed it. And Brené Brown says that's courage. It's not slaying, but taming. Taming so that we can tell the story with the whole of our heart. So we have Rainer Maria Rilke telling us to live the question rather than seek out the answers. And Brené Brown saying courage is to tell the story with the whole of your heart. So what happens when we bring those things together? How do we live the question with the whole of your heart? How do we step into that space with courage? When Claire invited me to speak, she asked me if I'd say something about hope at the end of the talk. And a few months ago, I really must confess, that was the biggest obstacle to me writing this speech, because because I think I'd spent so much time trying to slay my dragons that what was left was a fear-shaped hole in my heart. And instead, what I've learned is that maybe if we find courage together, maybe if we can tame our dragons and say, stand beside me as we step into this space and ask these questions, maybe then we can do it with the whole of our heart, and we're going to need that, aren't we? Because we bring the generations together and we seek wisdom from all sorts of different ages, and there is wisdom everywhere, and we look at the questions with different eyes, old, young, somewhere in between. But we're going to need courage. We're going to need courage to say, I don't know what the answer is, but that's okay. Maybe together, when we're living this question, we can find the answer. So my hope for you is that as you're thinking about all the questions you're going to be asked today, you have courage. So that in the year 2050, I'll be 66, by the way, and I can see you're working out how old you're going to be. And so that in the year 2050, when I'm sat on my rocking chair and I have my grandchildren at my feet and in my lap, I can look back on this time and I can tell my grandchildren some of the greatest stories that were ever told, that were ever written. Not just my story, your story, our story. Stories that began with us asking and living the question with the whole of our heart. And you know what? If I wake up in 2050 with a bit of a hangover, I think that's going to be a remarkable cure for it. Thank you very much.